Hello and welcome to a new series of Westminster Watch. It's Friday the 11th of September. I'm Professor Dermot Hodson from the Department of Politics at Birkbeck, and I'm joined as usual by my colleague Dr. Ben Worthy. We're going to talk in a very broad and open way today about the impact of COVID-19 on British politics, the unfolding impact that is. I wanted to start off by setting the scene a little bit about where we are as of September 2020. My point of departure, and I'm curious to hear yours, Ben, is that the government and the UK have seen their reputation damaged very badly as a result of COVID, if we look at the course of events since February or March. So as things stand, we've had in this country around 353,000 cases, more than 41,000 deaths. It's a national tragedy. Compare that to just 9,300 deaths in Germany. Countries are susceptible in different ways to COVID-19, of course, but I think the argument about damage to the UK government's reputation, and indeed the reputation of the country, is linked to the slow response of Boris Johnson to unfolding events earlier this year. We saw the first two cases of coronavirus in this country on the 31st of January, but it wasn't until the 16th of March that we saw restrictions on mass gatherings in this country. So there was a real lag in dealing with it. Similar restrictions had come into effect in Germany in late February. So there was a matter of weeks difference in the response, but those weeks seemed to make a major difference to the UK. Testing's been in the news a lot. The UK is now testing as much as Germany on a daily basis, if not slightly more. But testing in the early stages was very slow, incomplete, and lagged well behind. So if we compare UK and Germany again, the UK tested around 316,000 people by the 4th of April. In Germany, over 1.3 million people had been tested at this point. So it was a stark reminder of the differences in the quality of healthcare. So I guess the opening argument I'd make, Ben, is that the UK and its government have been damaged by COVID-19, given the scale of it and given the slow response of the Johnson administration, particularly in the early days of this crisis. Over to you for your thoughts.
Yeah, that seems to be what's happened. And there's two of the decisions in particular that I think will come under a great deal of scrutiny will be about when the decision was made to lock down, and then decisions over the protection of particular groups, particularly around care homes. I think stepping back and trying to decide what is been changing in British politics is really, really difficult. Of course, this government is a very new government, only came into power winning the election in December 2019. And it's very difficult to tell to what extent things have changed, or to what extent the pandemic has proved just to be an accelerator, a kind of catalyst for changes that we're already seeing. And I wanted to just pick up on kind of two examples of where it seems to be the pandemic is working as a catalyst rather than a sort of wholesale change. The first area is really over devolution. And we saw, even in the early days, but ever since, how it seems that the four nations of the United Kingdom seemed at certain points to be operating different policies at different rates under very different leadership. So, of course, you had the track and trace program in Northern Ireland that looked very different from elsewhere. You had different decisions around school closures, school openings. And what you're seeing is the kind of sharpening of territorial politics across the United Kingdom, where the different kind of component nations are doing different things in different places with different leadership. And if you go back 30 years, nothing like that would have really been possible. Now, of course, we get to the news this week about the internal market bill. And this is the kind of fundamental challenge to the United Kingdom about whether devolution is a one-way track. It was famously described as a process, not an event. But the big question is whether you can actually reverse or go backwards on devolution, and what then happens as a result. The second area where it's been a huge accelerator, and this came even as a surprise to me, someone who teaches and studies Parliament, is about backbench power. in the Houses of Parliament. Now, when Boris Johnson won what seems like long ago in December 2019, the 80-seat majority should have meant that he was very safe and able to do whatever he wished. And yet we've seen, as people like Alice Lilly have been pointing out for quite a while, a very kind of fragile 80-seat majority with U-turns in minor and major ways on all sorts of different issues over NHS parking charges, all the way to discussions about potential rebellions over the internal market bill. And again, it really underlines something that's been happening over decades, the fragility of government majorities and the fact that, as Anthony King famously said, that Britain is a over-the-shoulder democracy where a prime minister must look constantly over his shoulder. Partly this is about Boris Johnson himself, but it's also about the strange coalition of MPs that he's put together. You've got the kind of traditional Tory MPs plus the so-called red wall, northern inverted commas, Conservative MPs who all want different things and look like they're increasingly prepared to rebel. Looking over the pandemic, essentially Conservative MPs have probably noticed two things. One is that Boris Johnson doesn't care too much about what they think, as illustrated with the Dominic Cummings saga. But at the same time, they've also found out that if they apply pressure, changes can happen. And I would argue that that too is very much a one-way street. There's no going back once parties on the backbenches start rebelling against leaders. And it's going to be a rather bizarre time, I think, with a super acceleration of the trends that we saw under Tony Blair, but also under David Cameron, with a very rebellious and fractious party, essentially sort of forcing U-turns on their own government.
But can I pick up on one point in what you've said, which is about kind of continuity and change? Surely one major change as a result of this crisis is Boris Johnson's fall from grace. I think he was hit by proxy by Dominic Cummings, a breach of the lockdown rules, rules that he had helped craft, right? There's real contradictions there. And I think the refusal of Dominic Cummings to walk, and indeed his willingness to brazen it out in a press conference in the Rose Garden of Downing Street went down very badly. Compare that, for example, with very recent developments in Ireland, where an agriculture minister and Ireland's European commissioner have both resigned because they attended a golf dinner that was in breach of lockdown rules. Normal rules don't apply here, right? Politicians, their advisors, stay and brazen it out. But this has got to have an impact on legitimacy. Boris Johnson himself, of course, contracted the virus. And while there was a lot of, I think, very sympathetic coverage in the media at the time, rightly so, about his health and his personal situation, there's a sense in which I think that damaged him politically, right? I think it emboldened some of his rivals in the Conservative Party, and it brought attention to that slow reaction from Johnson. And so if you go back to the very early days of lockdown, Johnson was basking in the glow of Brexit, right? The deal that only he could get done. We'll come to that in a moment, whether that still holds. But his rating, his personal approval ratings in Ipsos Mori, for example, were plus 14 at this point. Very sizable. In the most recent poll I've seen, conducted on the 21st to the 24th of August, Johnson had an approval rating of minus 17%. So surely this is different, right? He is a charismatic leader who's been found out as a result of his slow response to COVID-19.
Yeah, I mean, it's a remarkable kind of collapse in political capital. Although, I mean, one person looking over Johnson's decisions could say that, Johnson, everything that was known about how Johnson performed as a politician was already known and long in the public eye. So this was all kind of well known in that even as mayor of London, he was not always the person in charge of the details. He would delegate to other people. He would rely on advisors and these ideas. So we all knew what was there. But, I mean, this is partly about the crisis itself. And this has been a huge, unprecedented crisis. And, history is full of leaders, think everybody from Neville Chamberlain onwards, who have simply kind of found it extraordinarily difficult to get to grips with the magnitude of something that's happening, even as it's happening kind of right in front of their nose. But it is remarkable the extent to which In a sense, public support may return, but I would again point back to the link between leader and party, which is a fundamental link in British politics, and the way in which he's burned the capital there. And at the same time, you see Keir Starmer, who's generally been thought to be doing a very good job. Again, I wouldn't overestimate the extent to which something like Prime Minister's questions really matters. But this forensic, continual repetition of the same issues time and time again, and also Starmer's quite canny avoidance of the traps that Boris Johnson seems to lay for him, over time that kind of could start to have a real impact on the huge issue, the big thing that Keir Starmer seems to be going after, and one of the big weaknesses, which is the question of government competence, which now stretches across from COVID, of course, over to Brexit with the events of this week. And it reminds me, arguably, of sort of Tony Blair in the 1990s, when he famously said at Prime Minister's Question Time, the major week, really hitting week after week about that issue of the government's inability and incompetence.
So let's look at the other side of the coin before we get to Brexit. The other side of the coin, quite literally, in the economic response to COVID-19. I mean, this has been fascinating. This seems to have been a game changer. So we saw an economic response to this crisis that could not have been more different than the coalition government's response to the global financial crisis, where the emphasis was placed on getting Britain's ballooning budget deficit down, cutting expenditure, living within our means, kind of classic conservative tropes about austerity. This seemed to have been ripped up almost straight away by Rishi Sunak, who had been in the job just a very short period of time before he was pushing out extraordinary policy responses. So, for example, if we look at the furlough scheme, it would have been impossible to imagine a Conservative government paying up to 80% of wages of people out of work, up to $2,500 per month. So what we're hearing in media coverage of this is that, in a way, Johnson has stolen Corbyn's clothes and become a kind of radical Keynesian. Now, I don't buy this for a minute, but I'm curious of what your views are.
I suppose there's a couple of points. The first point is, what choice did they have? I mean, there was no other choice except to do this. And the second point is how much of a problem this then becomes. And it kind of goes back to the unwieldy and slightly strange electoral coalition they've built as well. If, of course, you'd sat down and told me in December 2019 that the new Prime Minister would cover people's wages, nationalise the railways, I'd have presumed, of course, that Jeremy Corbyn would have won the general election. But this does make a difficulty for Boris Johnson and a Conservative government that is not naturally a government of this kind of supposed big state spending, and what it does to either reverse itself out of it, or even if it can reverse itself out of this in the coming kind of months and more likely years, is going to be a huge question. So I'd argue that Boris Johnson is on top of a kind of strange electoral coalition, but also in a completely new political landscape where lots of the old rules no longer apply. And on top of the strange economic landscape that he sits on top of, which he might not be able to back out of, he also is sitting on a new sort of territorial landscape of the four nations of the UK all doing things rather differently. So I'd say, yes, this is very different. They didn't have much choice. And the big political question is whether and how they try and kind of ever revert back to being more, inverted commas, traditionally conservative.
I've been struck by the slow speed at which economic numbers have come out in this crisis. Maybe it's on the usual frequency. I wouldn't pay kind of daily attention to these things. But we've had some very bad news on the economy, but very little news on public finances. So we know that according to Deloitte, the UK economy is expected to contract by 10.1% next year. I mean, that's an extraordinary contraction, much worse than we're seeing in Germany, although that's also bad, a contraction of minus 6.8%. But we haven't seen very robust figures yet on debt. The expectation is that government debt in the UK will be above 100% of GDP, and that's getting into potentially dangerous territory. It's at that point that we'll really be able to interrogate this government's economic policy. Is it really comfortable living with debt levels above 100% of gross domestic product and rising? That would be a real break, I think, from the kind of policies that we saw in 2008 to 2010. Okay, so we've alluded to this week's events in terms of Brexit negotiations a few times, so let's try and make some sense of this. Well, I was thinking, has COVID made much difference to Brexit negotiations? And my initial thought was that, well, British diplomats seem to have been social distancing long before COVID took hold. The reports coming from Brussels is that British negotiators were very cautious in their interactions with EU officials. Brussels is a well-oiled diplomatic machine, and that machinery works a lot of times through informality. The deals get done in coffee breaks, perhaps in restaurants, in the margins of the formal negotiations. But Britain for a long time now has been very formalistic, very cautious in how it's engaged with these negotiations, and it's paid a price for this, right? The classic consensus-seeking machinery that the UK was a part of when it was a member of the EU is now noticeably absent, and it's having an impact on talks long before COVID, I would argue. Then we get to this week's event, which is a new internal market bill, which calls into question the UK's commitments made in the withdrawal agreement. My initial reaction to this was Britain's got itself in a position politically where it needs an internal market bill, right? If we wind the clock back 4 decades, the UK was championing an internal market act in Europe, right? Thatcher was leading the charge for a single European market. Now the UK is in economic retreat and worried about the fracturing of its own internal market. And that's not without basis, right? Because this withdrawal agreement contained some pretty striking contradictions. So if you look at something like state aid, the agreement said that Northern Ireland would abide by EU rules on state aid, but there was also an ambition to have harmonisation across the UK. And yet, there were strong signals coming from the government that it would want to diverge from the EU on things like state aid to get a competitive advantage that it sorely needs post-Brexit, right? It's losing a close relationship with a major trading partner. It needs some source of competitive advantage. So that contradiction is apparent in the withdrawal agreement. But what was really explosive, I think, about this week's intervention was the very open, naked acceptance from the government that its solution to these contradictions was not further negotiations or consensus seeking with the EU. It was a brazen acceptance that it was going to breach the terms of a treaty that it's recently negotiated with the EU. Now that was pretty shocking. Your thoughts on it, Ben?
Well, I'm going to pick up on the word brazen. And if two things sum up the kind of career and style of Boris Johnson, it's brazen and bluff. And one of the questions is, who is being bluffed here? And to which audience is the government being brazen? And there's lots of different theories about what's happening here, trying to drag Labour into a discussion about Brexit again, having a fight on a kind of safer space for the Conservatives, or also doing a kind of negotiating tactic where you brazenly commit to do something and so that you can back down to a slightly better place. I don't think it's clear which of those it is yet. One thing I do find really interesting is the theory that Boris Johnson is hoping that Parliament, inverted commas, will block this so he can claim that he tried to get it.
I was immediately reminded of the decision to prorogue Parliament before a general election. They're looking for an enemy. In this case, it's the enemy without, potentially, right? The idea that the EU will now be putting demands on Britain to withdraw domestic legislation, that there's talk of court challenges. So EU kind of subbing in for the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom in that role it played in advance of the general election. A very helpful role, I think, for Dominic Cummings' strategy of kind of disrupting political institutions, being seen to fight for Britain. And so, I guess that's the way I would tend to read this, that it's Cummings looking to pick a fight to distract from what are the real contradictions that were inherent in the very project of Brexit itself. Now, that could work, right? That worked quite well for Cummings in terms of winning the general election, but of course it's got long-term consequences, the most striking of which is that Britain has undoubtedly damaged its reputation as an actor in international relations. Kim Darroch has been on the book circuit this week, a former very senior diplomat in the UK, and he argued that, Britain appeals to the rule of law and the legitimacy of treaties frequently, right? So if we look at, for example, Britain's claims that China was breaching the terms of its treaty on Hong Kong in recent months, it's extremely difficult for the UK now to make this argument. What might work in terms of short-term tactics, diversionary tactics, I think will have a big consequence on Britain's credibility and legitimacy as an actor in the international arena. And my other thought, and this is often the case, I think, in coverage of contemporary political events, that there's an immediate claim that this is unprecedented. Actually, it's not. And the more I thought about it, the more I was reminded of Maastricht, right? When the Maastricht Treaty went through Parliament, it won approval from the Parliament, but that wasn't enough for backbenchers in the Conservative Party who would not let that treaty rest, right? Even though the UK had given its consent to be banned. And I've written about this in my research that, in a sense, what we saw at Maastricht, and this was true of other European countries too, that the executive's legitimacy as a treaty maker was challenged from the early 1990s. In a sense, Brexit was a consequence of that, right? There was a push after Maastricht to find new ways to challenge treaties through the courts, through referendums, and this culminated in of course, the referendum in 2016, but that was never going to be the end of it. What we've seen is that the way in which treaties are made in this country have been challenged so much that they're now contested, not even and only by parliamentarians or courts, but even by the governments who conclude them. And that was, that was an incredible thing to see. But I think there's a long arc of what's happening here in terms of the politics and constitutional norms surrounding British treaty making.
And just a kind of final thought is that, to what extent did the British public care about this? I mean, you could see it happening before, but now, you've seen that obviously Brexit has fallen down people's priorities in polling, and at the same time, Johnson was voted in because he had a deal ready to go, the famous oven-ready deal, and now it isn't. So it may be much harder than if you think back to kind of this time last year. Much harder to engage people and make this kind of play and bluff when the audience has very different sort of attitudes.
If you'd like to learn more about research on politics at Birkbeck, about Birkbeck Centre for British Political Life, and about the range of undergraduate, postgraduate and doctoral programmes we offer, please visit our website at www.bbk.ac.uk/politics. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for more Westminster Watch.